So I invite to the podium the speakers who are experts in this field. Qimiao, Director for Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, the World Bank. Svoboda, he is of the CFA and he's also Deputy Governor of the National Bank of Ukraine. ex-Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Romania, and Geopolitics, the resident representative in Ukraine of the International Monetary Fund. Please welcome to the stage. And again, before we go to the voting procedure, one very important technical announcement. There are two very important people in this audience, Kulykov and Pavlova. They will operate the mics after the discussion finishes, and you will have approximately 10 minutes to question the panelists on what they have said. My request to you is to aim the questions precisely at whom we want to ask and state this openly. And again, we will have an opportunity to vote. Now, have you got your devices? Yes, very good. Because now, at the start of this session, we'll vote on two issues. One is formulated as international, another is local. But of course, in this world, everything is intertwined. So I would say that this is international one and international two. And the first question is, what do you think is the key economic growth factor for Central and Eastern European countries? A, EU integration, B, innovative and high-tech industry development, C, effective exploitation of existing natural resources, D, development of recoverable energy sources, and E, none of the above, or maybe other. So the voting starts now. You have 30 seconds, and I must say that even if you press the button 20 times, it still registers one vote. So the 30 seconds start now. Okay, and the result is that you voted that innovative and high-tech industry development is by far considered the key economic growth factor for Central and Eastern European countries, followed by EU integration. The first one got 51 votes, another one 27. We'll vote on this issue as well in the end of the session to see how the mood changed. Question number 2. Do you think the ongoing geopolitical crisis in Ukraine and Belarus will A, reduce investment opportunities, B, create new investment opportunities, and C, there is no crisis? You have to make a really hard choice within 30 seconds. Maybe some people are confused by this third option. Yes. Oh, seems that no one opted for the third option, and 57 of those who voted say that the ongoing geopolitical crisis will reduce investment opportunities. However, almost as many people, 54, say that it will create new investment opportunities. Well, the saying says that the time of the crisis is the time of opportunities, and it's up to us how to use them. Okay, so the subtopics for the discussion are suggested to be several of them, and the rise of neo-protectionist policies and the risk of deglobalization. How topical is this for the Central and Eastern European countries? I'd like Mr. Fan to be a key speaker on this particular issue, and then comments may follow from other panelists.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thanks to the organizers for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. In fact, this is the third time I'm participating in this outstanding annual conference. I must tell you that from the very beginning that math and politics were among the two subjects where I scored the lowest in my university entrance exam. So I'm not really good at both. But let me try to make a few points on this question of whether there is a risk of deglobalization. I think whenever you have a slowdown in the global economy, whenever you have recession, there will always be some concerns about protectionism and about the closing down of doors, particularly to trade and investment. However, I don't think today we have that risk. I think, if anything, the world is much, much more globalized. The world is much, much more open than ever before. Indeed, the world has become much, much smaller. What you see is that you have more and more countries are joining the WTO. You have more and more trade agreements, bilateral, trilateral, multilateral, all of them are actually about opening each other's market to the others and to the rest of the world. You also see, of course, the advance of technology, which frankly making the closing of the door much, much more difficult. Indeed, make integration much faster and much easier and much less costly. So I actually do not see that risk happening at this moment. Of course, we do need to guard against the populism. We do need to guard against the advocates who advocate for protectionism in these difficult times, because when times are difficult, there will be unemployment in those countries, and that's when you see the voices of those who say we need to protect our own jobs rising. And that's the kind of things we really need to guard against. But frankly, at this moment, I see we're much, much more integrated, and I don't really see the risk of deglobalization. Thank you.
Anyone on the panelists wants to briefly comment on what Mr. Fan said in this particular issue? No, then my additional question to you is, as a World Bank speaker, World Bank representative, could you tell us what the current programs of the World Bank expect from the Ukrainian government?
Thank you very much. As you all know, that the World Bank is, at this very moment, is actually the second largest financier for Ukraine. In the last 18 months alone, we provided a total financing of over $4.5 billion. Just to give you a sense of the scale, that's more than 60% of the total amount of money the World Bank provided to Ukraine in the 22 years altogether before that. So that's a huge scale up. So we have provided a significant amount of financing to do a few things. One is to support stabilization of the economy, as the Minister mentioned, both on the fiscal side but also in the banking sector, and to support many of the structural reforms that the country is undertaking, which are very difficult and needs financing to help to mitigate the risks, as well as the negative impact of some of these reforms, in particular to provide a more targeted social assistance program to the poor and the vulnerable who have been impacted by the increase in tariffs. So that's one area of support, is to support the stabilization of the economy, to support the structural reforms that the country badly needs. The second area of our support is really about investing in basic public services. In fact, almost half of our investment portfolio is in the energy sector, in power transmission, in hydro, in energy efficiency, in district heating. We are investing very heavily in the road sector, because as you all know, Ukraine's economy is actually very high freight content. It's therefore a good road network and efficient road work is very important for this economy. And we're investing, of course, in water and sanitation. These are services that every citizen needs. We're investing in, as I said, district heating. We're investing in health. We're investing in providing the social assistance that's needed for the poor and the vulnerable. And third, through both the World Bank itself, but also through our private sector arm, the International Finance Corporation, we're continuing to invest directly into the private sector. On the World Bank side, we have credit lines through Exim Bank for both energy efficiency, and in fact we had a project recently closed to provide financing for exporters. And of course IFC is investing directly into the private sector. And also through our multilateral investment guarantee agency, MIGA, we have provided guarantees to foreign investors, mostly in the banking and in the agribusiness sector. So we continue to invest in the private sector. So this is in a nutshell, the support we are providing through both of our financing, but also through our policy advice and technical assistance to the authorities to carry out much needed reforms. You also asked the question, what do we expect from the authorities? I think clearly, as the Minister mentioned, at this particular juncture, I think it's very, very important that Ukraine can maintain continued macroeconomic stability. That is a prerequisite. And if you allow me, I would actually like to make a point on this tax reform issue. I think the focus should not just be about what kind of tax reform is going to be good to have, but we also need to ask the question, what kind of tax reforms can Ukraine afford to have at this very moment? You cannot have tax reform proposals that will cut your tax revenues by 2.5 or to 5 to 8% of GDP without cutting your expenditure. Frankly, I think there are very few countries in the world where you're able to cut public expenditure by 20-25% a year, which is not possible. And in fact, this is what you will need if some of the tax proposals from some members of parliament are put through. It will require a dramatic and a drastic cut in public expenditure, which I don't think Ukraine can afford, because most of this public expenditure are already on pensions, other social spending, salaries, and defense, and other security. So there's really not a huge room to cut by that amount of public expenditure. What that means is that the country actually needs to look at very, very carefully the pacing of tax reforms at this very moment. So to actually urge caution in terms of the tax reform proposals. So I think it's very, very important to maintain stability. Second, I think it's also very important for the country to continue the structural reforms in the energy sector, to further deregulate businesses and continue to the restructuring and stabilization of the banking sector, and most importantly, there have to be much, much more concerted effort at tackling corruption, particularly reforming the judicial system. You can not have a decent investment climate if you don't clean up the corrupt practices. So I think it's very, very important that the authorities continue to these structural reforms which are really, really needed for the long-term growth of the economy. Lastly, of course, from our perspective, we have provided a lot of new lending. It's very, very important that these investments projects are implemented effectively and rapidly. Ultimately, it doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense for our board to approve a lot of lending to Ukraine when that money is sitting there, not being drawn and not being used, while people are waiting for services to be delivered. Thank you.
Thank you. Ukraine does rely heavily on foreign support in many areas, and I go to another representative of a major international financial institution, Mr. Jérôme Vacher, with a question, the answer to which, at least to the first part of it, may be obvious, but still repetition sometimes brings good results. So the question is why foreign donor help is so crucial at the moment, and what Ukraine will be able to do without.
First of all, good morning, and thank you for organizing this conference, which is always very useful because it brings a lot of, I think, investors to Ukraine. And it's also an opportunity to take stock of the reforms which have been put in place. As a minister, just to answer your question, I mean, the minister has clearly explained what we are seeing as financing needs for the country and how these financing needs could be met. So obviously it's an important component, but it's also important to remember that we are here to finance a program of reform, a program of macroeconomic stabilization, and that is our duty basically as international financial institution, and especially for the IMF, where our duty is to make sure that there is sufficient financial stability, and in particular that the external position is sufficiently sound. And that goes through good macroeconomic policies. Let me maybe just, also if you allow me, just let me to come back to some of the results of the polls that you have shown, because I think they are interesting. Of course, it depends very much on how you formulate the questions. But, the first one, I think, it would lead you to think that Ukraine is in the best position. Actually, the factor of success is just IT and technology. I mean, we all know that this country has tremendous potential. The same for EU integration. That being said, clearly the experience of the countries in the region is also that there are some preliminary steps to that, to make sure that this potential is fully exploited, and that means, again, sound macroeconomic policies and structural reform. And the same for investment opportunities. I mean, I think that you said correctly that crisis is the time for opportunities, but I mean, from our perspective, we are not investors, but from our perspective, a crisis is a time for reform. And I think, and reforms which allow to have sustainable growth, not just the boom and bust cycle that we have seen in Ukraine in the past, and which have not allowed sustainable growth and growth which would be fair and equally distributed among the population, which would allow to have, for example, a strong middle class. So this is a type of reform that we want to see, and I think all investors also want to see. There are short-term opportunities. I mean, it's a good time to invest in Ukraine. As the minister said, of course, I'm not an investor. I'm not providing investment advice. What I can see certainly is, as the minister pointed out, that the level of wages is now very competitive. It's a productive workforce. There's a lot of things to do, obviously, in terms of business environment and reducing corruption. And something that we, I think, all international financial institutions want to see. But all this to say that you know, it's a time for opportunity. It's a time for reform. The time for reform is to go hand in hand with the time for opportunities.
Mr. Boucher, you said that IMF is here in order to finance the reform. Does this mean that as soon as reforms are over, IMF will withdraw? And does this mean that some people in Ukraine are interested in protracting reforms as long as they can in order to still get the help from the IMF?
Well, I mean, you know, the past of the 23 past years has been quite difficult for Ukraine, and we have seen, unfortunately, episodes of reversals or very little progress on reforms. And certainly there is always a temptation, especially when economic times are particularly difficult, or there is pressure on household incomes, which is a reality at the moment, to advocate for some reversals. As I said, you know, we can only operate in a context where we have a strong commitment to economic and financial stability. If you take a longer run perspective, and that is also why it matters to us, because we have a four-year arrangement with Ukraine. So we take medium-term perspective as well. It is especially critical that structural reforms are put in place. So they are important by themselves, but for us they are also important to make sure that economic growth comes back and comes back in a sustainable manner. And so, you know, this is the angle that we have to take, and especially in this case where structural reforms are clearly, and some of them, in particular anti-corruption, are, from our point of view, macro-critical.
Thank you. Does anyone want to comment on what Mr. Boucher said? No? Another question is, Mr. Svoboda.
Yeah, I mean, you know, what Jerome said is definitely true, because the main key word in any reform is actually ownership. If there is no ownership of reform, there is no reforms. And that's basically always a key word in IMF programs. I mean, IMF programs are there to help you to plug a balance of payments. And then they're there also to help you to have kind of external yardstick if you have a difficult political environment, that this conditionality of IMF program can help you. But at the end, it's about ownership anyway. It's about local authorities, it's about domestic public in general to establish the ownership of their force. Yeah? I mean, IMF can provide you also useful advice, both during the program period and apart from program period, based on this experience from a lot of countries. I mean, it's also naturally when local policymakers are debating with IMF regarding this advice, as we usually do with the fund. But at the end, I mean, IMF is there to provide kind of advice and money, but ownership is still the domestic side. That's the most important.
Mr. Slova, I actually would hate to raise this issue, but I can't but raise it. I think that you and I, as millions of other Ukrainians, are very much affected with what is happening in the east of the country. I would love this not to happen, but there it is. We have to talk about this. And what's your expert opinion as a financier on how this impacts on the prospects of macro scenarios for Ukraine, this tension or this war? The floor is yours.
Well, I'll start kind of to provide a broader perspective. I mean, if you look back at the global economy, basically there is a big theme for the global economy in the past 10 years. If you look back before the crisis of 2008, that was external mismatches, with the saving a lot in one part of the world and kind of big consumption boost in the other part of the world. And it resulted pretty badly in 2008. Afterwards, the world was very busy with possible Eurozone breakup, sovereign debt crisis in Eurozone and PIGS countries, and possible breakups and so on. And now, indeed, I think geopolitical risks is coming to the agenda, not only kind of particularly Ukraine-Russia conflict, Middle East for sure, but also, I mean, there are all these tensions in Europe with possible secessionist movements like Brexit, Catalonia, Scotland, say, background for the policymakers. Because I'm kind of thinking myself, it's not so easy to endogenize geopolitical risk in a policy pattern. If you have, let's say, possible risk coming from terms of trade shock, like another big theme now is China in the world, and emerging markets definitely are affected by it. So, you know, Ukraine is a big commodity producer and so on, used to be a big commodity exporter. But for that, if you face a terms of trade shock, it might be easier to endogenize for policymakers. With geopolitical risk, it's not so easy. And also the issue, I mean, terms of trade shock normally affects you in the short run. Geopolitical risk is a more long-running story. And here you see from the poll, everybody believes that there is a geopolitical risk. So just confirming that there is no any illusions that it will resolve soon, both in Ukraine and the Middle East. People are pretty divided regarding whether it's good or bad, but it's always, I mean, the crisis provides an opportunity, that's for sure. And I think for us, the crisis is also provides us opportunity. Why? Because yes, in the long run, with geopolitical risk, to expect kind of huge exposure of people coming to Ukraine and trying to get kind of a high value-added production here, yes, that might be not so easy compared to the times when the global economy is booming, everything is okay, and so on. Although, coming back to the ownership, I believe even with geopolitical risk, the main task is lying here, domestically, and it's in terms of reforming Ukrainian economy. If you reform Ukrainian economy, you could better withstand this geopolitical risk. If we talk about military conflict, there are examples in the world.
Why do you say if, not when?
Yeah, I mean, I would say if and when, I would say, in this respect, because, you know, I mean, there are examples. Yeah, Georgia is an example, Israel is an example, Colombia is an example, which is not very relevant in this part of the world, but again, you just look at the situation. IMF and World Bank just organized their meetings in Peru, which also used to be very much plagued by the military and domestic conflicts with all these leftist groups and so on. So just indicating that actually with all these risks, whether they're exogenous or not, that's still up to the country to tackle it. The question is, as you said, if and when.
Thank you. Mr. Popov, I would like you, as a person coming from one of the closest neighbors of Ukraine, to take on from Mr. Solov, to comment briefly on what he said about tensions in the east of Ukraine, and continue with sort of a forecast. What's going to happen to European intentions of expansion in 2016? Europe is a very enigmatic continent. When I was at school, I didn't have good marks in maths. I had good marks in geography, because I could name all the three versions of where Europe actually ends, be it Ural Mountains, Caucasus, or elsewhere. Now I ask myself, as millions of Ukrainians ask themselves, will Europe, in the sense of European integration, embrace Ukraine, and when will this happen?
Well, let me first start by thanking the CFA Society and CFA Institute for the invitation that I received, and it's a pleasure to be here. Let me just recap the sources of risk that I see affecting not just the Ukraine, but the region, and the region obviously includes EU member states as well as countries that are at this point in time outside of the EU. One of those sources is obviously the tension at the Russian-Ukrainian border. The other is the Middle East, and the Middle East has been a continuous source, let's say, of tensions of many varieties. I think eyes are now more on Syria and on the resultant migrant problem, not just the conflict there. But let's not forget that the Iranian issue is showing progress, that it's not solved, and it will take time to solve it. And there will be tensions, I think, of other natures involving some other economies. The second source of risk, if I can geographically move slightly further south, is the fact that commodity prices having taken a hit from inter alia headwinds in terms of global emerging market growth being revised downwards quite substantially in the case of a very large economy such as China's, but not just China. Remember, please, that the new shining hope of the global economy in 2008-2009 were seen to be BRICS. Now, there's only one of those, and that's debatable as well, that is doing fairly well right now. The other letters in that construct are all facing their own challenges. But more specifically, commodity prices being down affect not just commodity exporters, they provide somewhat of a boost to growth elsewhere, but they also present a capital flow challenge because, as we have seen, outflows out of emerging markets are partly due to the fact that sovereign wealth funds in the Gulf states and elsewhere are revising their allocations and exposures. And that affects everybody in relative terms. Moving on, the sovereign wealth crisis in the Eurozone is affecting the EU more generally. I think that we are more optimistic in general right now about Greece, but it's still flashing red. It's just not as bright a red light as during the summer. That is not false.
Which color does Ukraine flash?
That's a very good question. I think it's flashing less brightly in terms of risk than it did before, and I'm basing this evaluation not just on sentiment, but on talks I had with investors directly or indirectly involved in the debt restructuring. I can tell you that I sense there's a very large amount of goodwill towards the Ukraine right now, and that negotiations, I understand, were leading to results that were acceptable to both classes of, let's say, debtor and holders of debt instruments. So I think that that needs to be kept. And that can be, if I may presume to give advice involving my own country's, let's say, record, that kind of goodwill can only be maintained by not just stating a reform plan, but actually implementing it. And structural reforms are a challenge for everybody, including in the European Union. Other sources of risk, I mean, the migrant crisis in itself, I think we will inevitably get to talk about that, so I won't touch too much upon it, but it presents a further fragmentation risk to mobility of factors within the European space. Now, the nice thing about math versus geography is that math tends not to change. It's more or less immutable, whereas geography sometimes does change. And in what does so, it presents a lot of risk and challenges to everybody undergoing that change. Let me move further on to the, let's say, European and especially Eurozone perspective. There's some good signs there in terms of growth perspectives improving slightly, more for this year than for the next. If you look at the latest release of forecasts from the European Commission, they've revised upwards by about 0.1% this year, from 1.5 to 1.6, but they've actually revised downwards for next year. The important thing is that we're seeing inflation converge closer to the ECB definition of price stability by 2017 or slightly later. So we're looking at 1.6, something like that, 1% possibly at the end of next year. 0.1 this year, at least it's in positive territory at this point in time. Of course, you have a lot of people forecasting. The OECD does these, the IMF, of course, does these. Those are a bit more optimistic. The important thing is that the Eurozone is underperforming developed economy growth, not just global growth. So there's fragilities as well, and the risks are there. What are the fragilities? I think the major problem is that despite low rates that ECB policy and policy elsewhere in the EU, for example, in the UK, have managed to put in place, we are not yet seeing a major uptake of lending, and we're not seeing, more importantly, a major surge in investment yet. That is, to me, the key fragility of growth in the medium and long term, and that needs to be solved. The second thing is that we have had internationally a debate, ideologically as well as practically, about what is the appropriate fiscal stance in a persistent slow growth environment. And you have two classes, of course, of opinions. I believe the answer is neither on one end of that spectrum nor the other. It's somewhere in the middle, and it's contingent upon the actual parameters of each given country, because it's good for growth to have some sort of fiscal stimulus. If in investment terms you have projects with high social returns, where risk is partly taken over by public investment, you need that to crowd in private investment, not crowd it out, and that is key. That also means that you have limited fiscal space in which to spend, so you need to prioritize. So I believe that the investment plan for Europe, if implemented, if funded and actually delivered, could be a big boost. The second problem is that it's not so much rates which appear to be impeding investment decisions right now. It's confidence in the evolution of the macroeconomy in the Eurozone and elsewhere. There is a lot of uncertainty, and that uncertainty hasn't gotten smaller, it's gotten bigger because of more diverse risk factors. The global ones were evoked by Mr. Svoboda here as well, playing into many considerations. You can make a nice trade if you're a market participant, for example, and do a VIX trading, for example, but other than predicting more volatility to come, I can't really be more specific. Back to my fiscal contention, let's not forget that the EU and the Eurozone especially, when compared to the US, is a more open economic, let's say, unit. Therefore, the non-Keynesian implications of fiscal policy need to be heeded. You can't just essentially spend your way out of the problem. The other thing is that it differs between Southern European states, where the degree of indebtedness is higher than the average, and Northern European ones, which is more a question of balancing and to see whether externalities can be created by spending. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone who wants to comment? Mr. Fan.
I want to make 3 additional points. One is this issue of what are the opportunities at the regional level. And the second is really the question on whether there are actually opportunities in Ukraine from the conflict. And thirdly, I wanted to answer this question of what are the scenarios. Here I actually wanted to focus on what the risks are. In terms of the broader regional picture, I think clearly the low commodity prices have hit many of the commodity-rich and export countries very hard. And you have seen that there's some very difficult adjustments being made through significant devaluation, real devaluation of over 30% on average in the last year or so of many countries' currencies. And this is also going to come in terms of the decline in real income as well as in employment. But I do see opportunities there. I think the opportunities are really in investments in the tradable sectors in these countries. With the currencies significantly devalued, and as you know, during the boom, the commodities boom, most of the investments actually went into the commodities sector, as well as the non-tradable sectors like construction. So I think now there's actually an opportunity for investors to invest in the tradable sectors where real wages are now much lower and the products from these countries can be much more competitive. So I think it's very important. Of course, that opportunity can only become a reality if these countries continue to undertake structural reforms that will continue to make them more competitive. The question of opportunities in Ukraine. Clearly, I agree with the Deputy Governor that there are the external geopolitical risks you cannot control. But what you can control are really your own policies, how you respond to those risks. Clearly, I think the most important thing for Ukraine at this moment is first really to maintain the still rather fragile macroeconomic stability, and 2, to continue to push forward with some of the difficult reforms. And here comes my third comment, and that is the risks. I see 3 risks to continue the macroeconomic stability and to continued increase in confidence in Ukraine. One is the current debate on tax reforms. Frankly, I think this hard gain of macroeconomic stability could be gone if some of these more populist type of tax reform proposals are adopted. The tax reforms have to be carried out in tandem with a broader review of the governance of the public sector, and that is also on your expenditure side. The second risk is really that some of the, again, more populist rhetorics trying to roll back the tariff reforms. Again, you all know the low tariff has been a major source of macro instability in the country, has been a major source of corruption and frankly has been a major factor that has undermined energy efficiency and energy security in Ukraine. If these market-oriented tariff reforms are rolled back, again, that's going to undermine macro stability. Again, I think that's going to undermine the efforts the authorities are putting in to improve energy efficiency and security. Ultimately, it's going to undermine the stability of the country going forward.
We've heard about prospects, we've heard about risks, and sometimes it seems that some crises, however predictable, still erupt unexpectedly. The so-called refugee crisis in Europe has posed a number of questions, and the question, well, is it really very significant for the prospects of investment and macroeconomic development in Europe as a whole, and how it will impact on Ukraine? And another question relevant to predictability is there maybe some country with a closed market looming out there as a possible competitor for attractional investment? There are countries with closed markets in Europe. Aren't they going to enter the scene and attract investors, thus rechanneling the possible investment from Ukraine? I address this question as an open question to anyone of the panelists who wants to venture their opinion. Mr. Russia?
Sure. I mean, I think this crisis, and I will just take the macroeconomic point of view from that, of course. This crisis raises a number of issues and sheds light also on some of the weaknesses and that we see also in Europe, either economic system or policies. So I think it sheds light on the differences in labor market flexibility that we see in Europe, and the capacity to absorb large movements of human capital. It sheds light also on the needs for populations which are aging and aging as a fiscal cost as well. In some cases, even the population is shrinking. How to take perhaps advantage of these flows. These are also flows of human capital, and there are opportunities in that. But again, it raises a number of issues, not only on the labor market, on fiscal policy. It raises issues on the housing market, for example. That's more on the, I would say, the direct impact on each member state, the EU as a whole. Then there is the indirect impact. That's more difficult to predict on the policies which will be conducted, and in particular the policies which will be conducted to vis-à-vis countries outside of the EU. But again, in some of this, first of all, let's not forget that Ukraine is facing itself a very difficult situation with internally displaced persons, and we have I think 1.4 million registered internally displaced persons. So, and that's also quite illustrative of the type of challenges that Europe faces. So we shouldn't forget about that. That also, it is of course very difficult, and it puts an additional burden on fiscal policy, because there is support which needs to be given to internally displaced persons, and we would entirely support that on our side. But at the same time, it also, although it is not obvious to see in the short run, it does also create some opportunities. In some of these crises, you see that some of the most mobile and qualified people leave the first, and that does sometimes have a positive impact, which can take Quite some time depending on the capacity to integrate, but it can have a positive impact also from an economic point of view. You know, I can take the example also of my own country, which faced a crisis like this. It's completely forgotten now, but it's, in the 60s we faced the issue of the...
Mr. Bashir, you're so closely associated with an international institution that not everyone knows which country you're talking about.
But it's France.
Okay.
But anyway, so this specific country faced a situation where it had to see the return of 1 million people in a very short notice, basically. And that, you know, was very difficult to manage. And even for the population which in fact came back to France, some of them had been outside for several generations. And it was difficult to integrate. But what we had seen, and also it depends, that also brings back to my point, is that it depends also very much on the starting conditions. I mean, of course, it was in a context of high growth, the labor market didn't have so much difficulties. And we saw at the time, over the course of the decade, some positive impact, in particular because there was a boom in construction. In some areas of France, there was a development which was quite significant in the south of France in particular. So, you know, we have to try to see a longer perspective to that as well.
You know, when you spoke of those people as human capital, I felt for myself really a glimmer of hope, because capital means potential, capital means opportunities. And I was personally very glad when you spoke in this vein also about Ukrainian internally displaced people. So I hope that many people in this country will treat them with more respect than they do now, and with more efficiency. And in this vein, I would like a Ukrainian participant to go on with this topic. Mr. Slova.
Yeah, basically just to reflect on what Jerome said, starting from the, as we already said about that crisis is not only the risk, it's also the opportunity. And I would say the current situation in terms of refugee crisis in Europe, this problem with internal displaced people in Ukraine is actually also providing the opportunity. If we look at Europe, for example, we should keep in mind that a substantial part of refugees which come from the Middle East, from Syria, is actually middle class people. So for Europe it actually means that in the longer run it's possible to accommodate these people, and it even could help to tackle demographic crisis, the staging crisis which Europe is facing. Of course it's not easy, it's politically difficult. And so far we see mostly these bigger side neighbor policies when you erect the fences, walls, and so on and so on. But I think for kind of long-term perspective, as also was mentioned by Jerome, that you should look through these short-term problems, short-term increase in the workload of your teachers, your social workers in Germany, Austria, and so on, your police. So yeah, that's just an indicating that it's not only about risk, it's also about opportunities. The same about Ukraine. Yes, it's kind of a big amount, and everybody was not prepared. Infrastructure was not prepared, social policy was not prepared, and so on. But again, I mean, just let's move from the different angle. Most of the people who flee Donbass, it's actually white-collar society, so people who with good skills and so on. And since Ukraine is also facing demographic crisis, and it's also not overcrowded. If you look at across Ukraine, except from a few big cities, you go to the regional centers, they're not overcrowded. So it's possible to accommodate these people. For that, you need, yes, governmental policies, but also what you need a business climate. The person from Donetsk, which used to have a business there, could go to Zhytomyr, to Cherkasy, and establish the same enterprises there. Yeah? The kind of the main value of the enterprise in Donetsk was not, let's say, building, yeah, or something else. It was basically brains of people who were working there in hands. Yeah? And that, I think, it's also a kind of good opportunity to change.
Thank you very much, and I hope we'll see the time when entrepreneurs from Zhytomyr and Cherkasy can go to Donetsk and establish their businesses there. Mr. Fan, about the closed markets, about the countries which still do not allow or do not attract foreign investment, what's your opinion on this issue?
I think there are clearly opportunities in some of these countries. In fact, I just returned from Belarus last night. I was there on Tuesday speaking at the October Economic Forum. If you just take Belarus, again, this is a country which I think has huge potential for both the country's growth, but certainly for foreign investors. Its strategic location, its access to both the Eurasian economic space and to Europe. It also has a highly skilled and highly disciplined labor force. If you look at the infrastructure, roads, electricity, they're all pretty decent. And the broad education system and health, quality of health service is also quite reasonable. So, but for that opportunity to become, again, a reality, the country needs to undertake significant amount of structural reforms. The problem you have in Belarus is really an unlevel playing field for the state-owned enterprises and the private sector. You have an economy that's hugely dominated by state ownership. That's not just in the real sector, but in the financial sector as well. And you have a lot of directed credit going to the state-owned enterprises. So first and foremost, I think they need to create an environment that create a level playing field for both state-owned and private enterprises and for foreign investors. So I think if they can do that, then the opportunities are huge there. You can, I mean, salaries in the manufacturing sector for that kind of highly skilled labor force is still $200 to $600 a month, right? So it's still very, very cheap, and as I say, a very disciplined labor force. So a lot of it will depend on what the authorities do, whether they can actually further open up the economy by allowing private and foreign investors to come into some of the sectors which are currently restricted, but also by creating a level playing field and less control and more deregulation of the economy in there. If they can do that, then there are huge opportunities for investors.
Mr. Svoboda, your comment.
Thank you. On this idea of competition for investment, I think it's a very good question. I would focus it, I think it's more productive to focus it not on what part of the finite amount of capital going around can you attract per se, but how you attract it and how you keep it. And it's a question about the quality of policies. We have two tests that basically have gone through the region and worldwide, which were the taper tantrums of May, June 2013, and then early 2014. What do we see there? For the first time, you saw clear discrimination, in a positive sense, by investors for those countries where policies were seen as sustainable, as predictable, who either had a fund / European Commission / World Bank / EBRD agreement, or some other kind of setup, which was a domestic policy anchor, and which had a promise for structural reform going forward. You also saw countries being rewarded not for having a super tight necessarily fiscal position, but for going for fiscal discipline, which was appropriate to the phase of the economic cycle in which the country was and in which its partners were. And that's very important. Romania, for example, lost money just like everybody else initially. That money returned and more came in within the space of 3 weeks to a month. So good policies actually pay. And if you keep them over time and basically convince in a credible way investors that those policies are set to stay on target, and there is a little bit of predictability, that's very good. The second comment I would make is that this involves stimulating private sector investment and innovation. There is pretty much one way you can guarantee better growth in a sustainable way, and that is to increase potential GDP. Now, potential GDP happens to be about 2/3 to 80% the stock of productive capital. And the way you do that is by investment, by productive investment, going to tradable sectors, going to other, let's say, business opportunities. But that in turn depends on everything else. So I think that this is a very important thing. I completely agree with both Mr. Bachet and Mr. Svoboda on the, let's say, longer-term benefits of the migration problem. The problem is that the short-term benefits have a fiscal implication, they have a resilience implication, that's distributional issues within countries, per regions, and also the way you share the burden between countries, which will be a test for the European Union. It may be a very difficult test to pass. In the longer run, you can have these people possibly integrating economically. The social implications will not be lost. We have countries in which communities that immigrated in the 60s and 70s are still fairly separate. I'm not sure that's a really bad thing, but it has brought challenges, even as recently as, let's say, 10 years ago, in Germany, in France, elsewhere. But let's look at Scandinavia, where the demographic problem is much more pronounced than elsewhere, and where the immigration solution has basically compensated for the way demographics were going and has kept the possibility of economic growth, let's say, brightly lit.
Now, if I were an Eastern European country, I would probably attract much investment because my policy is very, very predictable. I'm going to say that very soon we'll open the floor to questions. But before this, are there any concluding remarks that you would like to make? If not, then I have a question for you. Any concluding remarks? Any summing up? No? Then, the minister spoke here about the investor-friendly climate which we have to create in Ukraine. I changed the place of the words, and instead of investor-friendly, I say friendly investor. Could any one of you, within 30 seconds, paint a portrait of an ideal friendly investor for Ukraine? Who wants to start? 30 seconds. Mr. Slova.
One particular example, a big multinational FCG company which used to have a business in Russia and serving the region from Russia. And now it could go to Ukraine, not only serve Ukraine, but also other countries in the region.
Very specific portrait. Any other? Mr. Fan.
I think a good investor is a long-term investor who can bring in not just the capital, but the technological and managerial know-how, and can make good use of the local labor force.
I would say an impressionist kind of portrait where you see the general features but cannot discern the actual face. Mr. Popov.
I agree with Mr. Fan. Also, not just long-term, but the benefits of that investment have to be shared equally between the country receiving the money, either directly in the term of an FDI or through portfolio flows, and the investor community themselves.
And the group portrait in Mr. Popov's rendition and Mr. Vasha.
So, I mean, just to add to what has been said, I mean, a friendly investor would be one who would be committed to the long term to this country, and not only to its business. And we spoke about human capital, and that's also one aspect of it. And that is also something not necessarily for the large foreign investors. I mean, I think it would be good to see also some medium-sized businesses coming to Ukraine. And I have some examples of that, but it's still not enough. And when we will see that, I think it will be definitely very encouraging.
Okay, so Mr. Vasha added a close-up portrait to our gallery, and now the time has come for questions from the audience. Please raise your hand if anyone wants to ask a question. No? No questions? Yes, please.
Mr. Fan, my name is Boris.
Yeah, just get the mic so that the interpreters can hear you. Yeah.
My name is Boris. I'm global soil advisor to Mr. Fan. Mr. Fan, you are looking at the whole world from a big position, from a global states, helping global countries. What do you think AIRD, Silk Road Fund, BRICS, will they help at all this region? Not? Neutral? What is your feeling of that?
I think in the long run they will. And obviously at this moment, unfortunately, I don't think Ukraine and Belarus or Moldova are the focus of AIIB or the Silk Road funds. But clearly, I think both of these are fairly open concepts and open institutions, and they're still evolving. I think in the end, when they see opportunities, they will.
Anyone wants to add? Anyone wants to ask another question? Yes, please. The mic is coming. Yeah.
My name is Andriy. My question actually is for Jeremy. I'm quite curious about the funds that are being given to Ukraine right now. What will be the situation if, for instance, the kind of reforms you expect are not up to the expectations? Are you still going to put in more funds, or you're going to quit on reform? I'm asking on the basis of, for instance, like for my country, Kenya, there are resources which were given before by the IMF, but as for now, the reforms which were put in place before, they are no longer there, they are faded away. So as for Ukraine, are you going to put in more funds, even if the reforms that you expect won't work?
Okay.
I mean, as you know, we had a situation in previous programs where some of the programs were stopped or went off track because there was no commitment to reforms. We also had a situation where the authorities at some point had requested an arrangement, and we just didn't see any commitment to reforms, and we just could not negotiate an arrangement. So I think, from that perspective, it is pretty clear. And the way we operate is also that we disperse in tranches. We have a 4-year program, but it's dispersed in tranches and in quarterly tranches, and that's why we have reviews. And during those reviews, we take stock of what has been achieved, what has been done in terms of quantitative targets, and what can be the policies going forward. So it is critical that we have this commitment, of course, which is reflected in the documents that are signed by the authorities, in this case the Ukrainian authorities, which, as Tim has said, reflects also the ownership of the policies, and that is pretty important for us. So that's how we operate, and we are here to basically to support the country in achieving greater external stability, both financial and external stability, and this is done through sound macroeconomic policies and reforms. So that's what we can support, basically.
Anyone wants to add? No? Mr. Fan?
Can I add a comment on this first question? I think, one of the silver linings of the slowdown in the Chinese economy is that you're actually going to see fewer investment opportunities domestically for Chinese investors, as well as foreign investors there. So you are going to see an increasing interest from Chinese investors in countries that have both, obviously, a stable investment climate, lower labor costs, but also access to a large market. And clearly, I think, also in areas where the sector is also complementary to what China needs, say agriculture. So I think in that sense, there are actually huge opportunities for Ukraine to attract investment from China right now, and also from other Asian countries for that very reason.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes. Please give the mic to the gentleman in the first row, and then the gentleman in the third row will ask.
Previously you mentioned that Ukraine is kind of not on the road of the Silk Road. I talked to Silk Road and I talked to EIB. They are quite open to investments everywhere, including the United States of America. So you can just confirm with the second comment.
Duly noted. And the question from the third row, please.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for comments and your input. I'm going to ask a bit provocative, probably question, Rob. Don't take it as an offense. Just trying to.
We would like to know who asks provocative questions.
My name is Darius. I'm come from the investment banking sector, but I currently work with the Minister of Economy, advising on international foreign assistance, donor assistance. So my question would be a little comment and then a follow-up question. Andriy, who received the Nobel Prize for economy this year, one of the areas he's researching is poverty and welfare, and you probably know the comment he made about that donor assistance is actually harmful for the countries on a long-term basis, because basically the financial aid is actually helping to keep the corrupt leaders afloat. They're using the funds to fill in the holes instead of actually doing the changes. So my question would be, and coming back to your comment at the very beginning, Mr. Fan, that you said it's impossible to do tax changes without decreasing the expenses of the country. This very much reminds me of the situation we had in Lithuania, because I'm Lithuanian, and in 2009 we actually had this crisis week in the parliament, and parliamentarians to order pizza overnight and do the tax cuts of like 15–20% to the government officials, and that was the first government in the independence of Lithuania to actually serve a full 4 years, because the political opposition knew that although the changes are very harmful to the people, they are needed at that situation, and that very much reminds me of the situation here. So the question would be, what is your take on donor aid in helping in the country in the long run, and what changes, like really drastic changes you would do in Ukraine on a short-term basis? Thank you.
To whom do you address your question?
Probably to Mr. Vanchel and Mr. Fan.
Who'd like to start? Mr. Vashin.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the example of Lithuania. I happened to work on Lithuania in 2009, 2010. And you're right that it is an example of strong adjustment, which actually was done without financial support from the IMF. Although we at the time worked very closely with the government, and which was led by Prime Minister Kubilius, to provide advice both to the Bank of Lithuania and to his government. So, and the policies were in fact fully in line with what we would have seen in the program, and it was quite similar to Latvia in that sense. Now, you know, this was also a fiscal adjustment which was significant, which was, even though Lithuania was starting from a low level of debt, but it was operating in a currency board, which made the situation even more difficult, but what also, I think, allowed these policies to proceed with the flexibility of the labor market, which helped a lot as well, which is not something that you always see in the euro area. Now, that being said, I mean, you mentioned the expenditure adjustment there, and just to take this as a comparator, you know, we were mentioning the need for example, to cut expenditures, which would be related to some of the proposals which are in Parliament on, which would basically require a cut in expenditure of 9 or 10% of GDP. Lithuania did that, but it did that over 3 years, not over 1 year, and in a very difficult, in a very difficult situation, but in a very different situation, and also because Lithuania was able to undertake a lot of reforms and structural reforms, which also allowed it to bounce back and to have a relatively, you know, strong recovery. Of course, not the type of growth that we had seen in the previous years, pre-crisis, but that's, you know, it's also an illustration that pre-crisis we had a situation where a lot of the countries in the region were growing with large current account deficits and with banking sectors which were growing way too fast, as we know, and credit was going way too fast. And that is also something that has changed, and it's a structural change, and that is also, I believe, a lesson to Ukraine. And the comparison to some of the years of growth that we have seen is a bit misleading in that sense.
Anyone wants to add or extrapolate on this? Mr. Fan, Mr. Bobo?
I mean, on the tax reform, the point I'm making is really that you can't just reduce taxes without corresponding adjustment in expenditure. That just simply does not work. If you wanted to cut taxes by 5% of GDP, you have to cut your expenditures accordingly. Otherwise, you're not going to have macro stability, and frankly, that's the last thing we want in Ukraine. On the effectiveness of development assistance, I think that's a perennial issue in the debate. I have huge respect for Angus Deaton. I don't know if he remembers, but he and I do shared an office at the London School of Economics for a period of time when he visited. But I think on this particular issue he's wrong, and I disagree with him. I think, it's very clear that international assistance that help countries to invest in its human capital, to invest in health education, in infrastructure, and to support policy reforms have worked. When international assistance has not worked, it's when you just throw money at a problem without really addressing the root causes of those problems, and such as the structural reform issues. So I think when these assistance are accompanied by appropriate policy changes and are focused what the country really needs, and when you have ownership to address these issues, then international assistance is not just effective, it's a must. Clearly, ultimately, any assistance can only work if the country wants it to work, and that is by having the ownership, by undertaking those reforms to accomplish those assistance.
Thank you very much. Mr. Popa, briefly, please,
yes.
as we have to vote again.
Of course. As, let's say, somebody who's worked in an authority of a recipient country, I think it's very important to realize that that's why you have conditionality attached to amounts of financing, be they for replenishing or for actual, let's say, support of fiscal expenditure. And that's why also programs are limited in time and in amount, because it's not usually just one country requiring, especially in downturns like this one, support. The first important thing is that the ultimate goal should be self-sustainability, developing the internal capacity on different levels to move out of the program at the appropriate time. The second is that the program is usually designed to protect against the manifestation, the realization of external shocks that may have repercussions domestically. And the third is, ultimately, there is always, I think, on behalf of both the recipient country and the donors, the thought of gradually, and at some point in time, moving the country into a position that it can finance itself independently on international capital markets.
Thank you very much. And now it's time to vote again on the two questions that we voted on when the session started. So let's vote on what do you think is the key economic growth factor for Central and East European countries? And the options are the same. A, and you may start voting. A, European integration. B, innovative and high-tech industry development. C, effective exploitation of existing natural resources. D, development of recoverable energy sources. And E, none of the above or other. Well, at least I remember now the beginning of the English alphabet in addition to the math. And the results. Results. Innovative and high-tech industry development gained 8 votes compared to what was there at the beginning of the session, and EU integration, although remains in the second place, lost 5 votes. So the major factors for CEE development remain those two, according to you. And the second question that we voted on was, do you think the ongoing geopolitical crisis in Ukraine and Middle East will, and you may start your vote in A, reduce investment opportunities, B, create new investment opportunities, C, there is no crisis? And I remind you that, oh no, I should not impact on your voting. I'll remind you of the results when you have voted already. A, reduce investment opportunities, B, create investment opportunities, C, there is no crisis. And 58 people say that it will create new investment opportunities, which is 4 votes up compared to the morning voting, and 52 people say reduce investment opportunities, which is 5 votes down. And we at last have got people who believe there is no crisis. 3 of them compared to 0 in the morning, so I see that the discussion here really impacted on how people see the world. And now, almost reaching the end, I think it will be only just to give the mic to Johan Hermenuk, who didn't get the opportunity to speak to us. He has a question, I think. No? You skipped the question. Okay, you will hear from Mr. Hermenuk at later sessions. I thank the panelists very much, especially for the fact that you did impact on the mood in this session. I have also to thank the 2 very important people in this audience, in this room, whom you almost never get to see, and when you see them, you do not recognize them. These are simultaneous translators. Today, these are Tatiana and Roman. And what I have to say, now you will have not just your regular coffee break, but a networking coffee break. You're expected here back in 30 minutes. Thank you very much.